Our next speaker is Gilbert Sorebo. He's the Chief Cybersecurity Technologist at Leidos, a large federal contractor. He spends a great deal of his time on the company's commercial cybersecurity strategy, which is very interesting for a federal contractor. So we're looking forward to your remarks. Gilbert's got his degrees from Catholic University, George Washington, and the University of Chicago. Great to see you. Thanks a lot.
Well, as you just noticed, being here in Washington, many of us know Leidos as a federal contractor. However, we do have a significant amount of our business both in commercial cybersecurity as well as a much larger business in working with utilities in engineering and smart grid solutions. In fact, one of our solutions is what we call smart grid as a service, which offers the ability to take over the advanced metering infrastructure for the utility. You can take ownership over it and operate it for them to move from a CapEx to an OpEx model. And so we have a very clear understanding of what some of the smart grid privacy concerns are and making sure that they're addressed. But it's important when we look at this area to understand what we're really talking about when we talk about smart grid data. So for a lot of privacy folks, this may mean the measuring and attributing that data to a particular consumer, particularly at the smart meter at the home, the aggregate use of that home. But for others, they may look, and other speakers have referred to more granular measurements of looking at individual appliances. And for a lot of consumers, they may say, well, I really don't care, how much, whether you get my data on my aggregate use. What I really care about is whether you get time of day information or appliance use. However, some consumers were certainly upset when a utility a few years ago decided to publish a map of all of their customers and showed the high energy users at each house in sort of a shaming exercise. So it probably wasn't a very good PR for the utility to do that, but it certainly indicates that there are concerns and sometimes they're not easy to draw out just by asking simple questions. But in reality, utilities generally don't have detailed energy usage down to an appliance level, at least from the smart meter. The frequently cited study where people point to being able to collect that data was actually a fairly tightly controlled experiment where they measured data at the junction box and were able to measure in 2-second increments and therefore extrapolate from that whether somebody was using a refrigerator, a washing machine, or since this was a British study, a kettle, I believe. And so the utilities really can't do that. They usually measure in 15-minute increments and sometimes longer. And as a result, they don't really have that type of data that they could actually extrapolate. Figuring out what television show someone's watching, yes, that's possible in a lab. It's not really practical in normal operations, and quite frankly, they don't really have a desire to get that information. Other technologies may be available through the Internet of Things where we could actually extract that. Manufacturers and others are already distributing appliances, as many of the other speakers have said, that can measure that data and potentially provide that back to the manufacturer or through other third parties for various purposes to monetize it or what have you. Utilities explored a few years ago getting home area networks and Zigbee and other technologies to measure more fine-grained usage. There's some programs that do, through demand response, offer the ability to shut certain appliances off or lower people's thermostats for certain purposes. But they really moved away from really having this sort of home automation system, and we're seeing this really being picked up by other manufacturers and other sellers like the Google Nest and others. So it's really, when we're talking about utilities, it's really a different world. But understanding where the measurements are taken is not only informs the potential security and privacy vulnerabilities, but it also indicates, first of all, the electricity itself doesn't contain any data. It's really the ability to associate that data at different locations in the grid, such as someone's home or at other places, and really it's through that attribution process, or what some data scientists call data enrichment, that you actually get some of the privacy issues. So in some cases, at a very practical level, the utility is simply using metrology to measure a device that they own at different parts in the grid that they also own. And in many cases, someone would say, well, that qualifies as really owning the data. However, as other speakers have pointed out, when you start attributing that data to particular consumers, when consumers have a contractual or other relationship with that utility, there's some expectations of not only ownership or at least the ability to control how that data is used, not to mention public relations considerations as well. So a lot of those issues still have to be addressed, even though, from a purely technical sense, ownership may not be as clear as we might think. Understanding where we are today with business models actually makes this, where business models make sense, can instruct on where we need to prioritize in reference to smart grid security and privacy issues. For utilities and their customers, a more pressing concern would be malicious actors' ability to gather smart grid data and use it to somehow manipulate power delivery to cause outages, to damage to equipment, or actually harm to human lives. Consequently, we need to be careful about placing restrictions on how utilities use this data because it could inhibit their ability to protect the grid from these sorts of threats. While those that rely on aggregated data across thousands of customers, individual customer data may be needed for billing accuracy, for conducting troubleshooting and verify compliance. So even if we attribute the fact that individual data needs to be protected more, we need to acknowledge the fact that data is still needed for a variety of purposes that benefit the consumer as well as everyone else. Certainly it makes sense when we look at utilities wanting to sell that data to other parties for other purposes that we certainly need to look at that more carefully. And therefore get authorizations. But it's certainly, we want to be cautious of the fact of putting too much restrictions on how that data is used, particularly for operational purposes. In the near term, much more granular data collection will likely come from home automation solutions and not really from utilities. With the exception of the Texas market, which has a different model with lots of retail electric providers, most other utilities really aren't in the business of providing this level of granularity. So it's here where consumers dealing with the manufacturers and the products that you can buy on Amazon or at Best Buy, that they really need to look closely at what they're buying. Manufacturers will likely need to seek to sell usage data, both to monetize it as well as to gain greater capability for that. But it's not really likely to be a huge market in the near term. A lot of the business models really haven't developed to the point where we see a lot of advantage for this, particularly in the United States. When we talk about things like electricity theft and other issues, aside from marijuana growing and a few small issues, a lot of the issues that we see overseas don't show up in the United States because for most people it doesn't make a tremendous difference. And so for a lot of people, we still need to be able to see the consumer benefit to getting more granular data before them to sort of buy a Nest. A lot of people buy a Nest and 2 weeks later they'll forget it's there. So in terms of cybersecurity though, deployments of advanced meter infrastructure are reasonably secure. We went through a period over the last 10 years where it was very poor security to fairly good security from a large general security perspective. The data is encrypted. There's pretty good protections all the way from the meter to the meter data management system. Certainly when the data goes other places, it may have varying levels of protection. But for the most part, yes, there are certainly some risks, but they're certainly manageable. When we look at just pure data collection, that's usually pretty good. There may be ways that people can disrupt meters, disrupt electricity usage, and you certainly want to be aware of that. But for the general collection of that data, security is fairly good right now for most utilities, not at least those that are implementing some of the more recent AMI deployments. Typically, the biggest worry with usage data is usage data could be used to identify people on vacation or other things that people point out. Again, a burglar probably has other ways of getting that data, or at least getting things. There used to be a website called pleaserobme.com where they pulled social media data and they basically pointed out when people were telling when they're on vacation, when they're at a bar, when they're other places. So, there's plenty of other sources of that information that are a lot easier to get than hacking into a utility. So it's important to really put that in perspective. As we see distributed generation like solar and wind at residential level, there will be more demand for energy analytics and other things, and therefore more demand for cybersecurity and more demand for privacy protections. And so as technologies evolve to electric vehicles and having sub-metering for electric vehicles, we're going to have more granular data and more data that can be exploited. And so it's watching as those things develop that we need to be more concerned about that. So in the interim, our best approach is really ask questions, read the fine print and the user agreements when we buy these Nests or these Echoes, and hold off on regulations until later on when we actually have a better understanding. So we allow the community to innovate and allow consumers to really vote with their wallets about what actually they want, but try to be as transparent as possible.